A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the HIT Foundation Dialogues. My name is Vignesh, and I'll be your moderator and MC for today's book launch. Today, we're very honored to be able to have the three authors of teacher preparation in Singapore share their perspectives and insights from the book that they have authored. And we have two distinguished academics, Dr. Kevin Blackburn and Professor S. Gopinathan, who will be discussants for their launch. Ladies and gentlemen, let me quickly share with you the program for today's event. Soon after my introduction, I'll invite our authors to share their perspectives on the book that they wrote. Each of the authors will take some time to expound on sections that they authored and sections that they believe are extremely vital and important to today's discussion. We will then adjourn for a short time to allow for questions from the floor where you may seek clarification on anything that was presented by the authors. I urge all of you to type your questions in the Q&A chat, as there are no other options through which one can ask questions. I will ask your questions on your behalf to the authors during the clarification session. After we have clarified any doubts that you may have, we will then invite our two discussants to share their perspectives on the book. Following that, we'll move to the last, but certainly not the least, and possibly the most exciting part of today's book launch, which is the Q&A. During this section, we'll invite you to discuss with the authors and the discussants about their perspectives shared in the book. What are your opinions and your thoughts? How relevant and accurate do you find them? Are there areas that we should be discussing that we have yet to do so? Do type all your questions in the chat box as they come up, and I will ask them on your behalf. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today on the HIT Foundation Dialogue. The HIT Foundation, a modest philanthropic foundation based in Singapore, organizes regular dialogue sessions to invite thought leaders and leading thinkers from across the region and beyond to share their perspectives on pressing issues in education and healthcare. So I hope you enjoy today's dialogue and our book launch on teacher preparation in Singapore. And we are honored to have our three authors join us today. Dr. Chia Yeow-Tong is a senior lecturer at the Sydney School of Education. Dr. Alistair Chew is the founding director at Findings Education. And last but certainly not least, Associate Professor Jason Tan is at the National Institute of Education in Singapore. So, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, let me please invite Yeow-Tong to share his perspectives and an introduction to this book. Yeow-Tong, please.
Thank you, Vignesh. It's afternoon where I am, so I'll say good afternoon and good morning to all of you. Before I begin by my brief remarks, I would like to acknowledge that I'm zooming in from the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of Eora Nation and pay my respects to the Aboriginal elders past and present. And on behalf of the Malaysia and Singapore Society of Australia, MASA in short, which is the peak association for the study and academic research and study of Malaysia and Singapore in Australia, of which I'm the president, I would like to thank HIT Foundation for co-hosting this webinar, because you see as our logo also on the publicity materials, and for providing the technical support. Rather than start with a brief synopsis of this book, let me begin with how this book came about. The genesis began with an email from Professor Tom O'Donoghue in the University of Western Australia in December 2016 to write the history of teacher education in Singapore. Tom is one of the editors of the Emerald Book series on teacher preparation in national and global context, where this book is a part of. As Tom taught a unit or course or module, we call it in Singapore, when I was doing my master's in UWA, I find it hard to say no to him. After all, he was the one who indirectly introduced me to the field of history of education. And I subsequently, asked Jason, and Alistair. And Jason taught me actually when I was a training teacher back many years ago in NIE. And Alistair was actually formerly my colleague at ACS Independent back when we were both teaching there to co-write the book. So I'd like to thank both of them for co-writing this book together, as I wouldn't have the headspace or capacity to write this book by myself, as teacher education is not something I previously published on prior to this book. I'd like to also place my thanks to Tom O'Donoghue for his encouragement and constant reminders to get the book manuscript submitted. Now, this book aims to be the first non-celebratory based and non-institution based account of Singapore's teacher preparation, written with a critical academic lens. It aims to fill a gap in the studies of Singapore's educational history, as well as the history of teacher preparation in Singapore. And this book is situated within the broader narrative of Singapore's educational history, and hence, to some extent, the overall, as well as the overall history of modern Singapore. So there's a broader context. Nonetheless, it's important to note that this book does not claim to be a comprehensive and definitive history of teacher preparation in Singapore. Rather, it is a contextual and critical history of, and I will note in the title, concise as well, of history teacher preparation from the colonial era to the present day. And now with these brief remarks, I'll now pass the time to my co-authors to briefly talk about the salient points of the book. So pass the time to Alistair. Thank you.
Good morning to everyone from Singapore. Right now, I'd like to thank Yeow-Tong, of course, in return, because he dragged me into this. I was originally a chemistry teacher, teaching chemistry and computing. And somewhere along the way, I ended up being a historian. So any deficiencies in the work are entirely mine, since I'm new to the game. So chapter 1 of this book is actually about how colonial government policy as such did not exist at all in the field of teacher preparation. The teachers that we got were matters of fortune. Some of them were missionaries, some of them were merchants, some of them had other trades. The one thing they had in common was the colony of Singapore, which was a commercial proposition. Therefore, most education in Singapore at that time, or teacher preparation, was entirely a matter of preparing people to do certain jobs. The kind of practicum, if such a practicum existed, was mainly didactic, it was rhetorical. The main aims of education and preparing teachers for education were to get them to transmit knowledge or information and persuade people that this was true. So it was a kind of Western enlightenment, not in the philosophical sense, but the idea that the West had many things to offer. The benighted heathens and so on should probably accept them. And thus, missionary schools were a formative element of this entire enterprise. So what was the government doing? Was there any centralized teacher preparation at all? The main thing is that government enthusiasm for teacher preparation was close to zero. In fact, support for education in general was close to zero in the early years. Most of it was generated by the locals, and of these locals, the most important were the Straits Chinese, because they saw a route through education to political domination of the colony. They couched it as education will lead to ambition, ambition will lead to self-governance. And this was something from the late 19th century. It wasn't something that came about only in the nationalism of the 20th. So that is an interesting thread to pull on. And fortunately, in Singapore, there are enough people around who remember those years and have records of those years. One of the obstacles I found in writing these chapters was that there were very few people left to tell the tale, and the tales that had already been told had been somewhat pruned over time. So you had a triumphalist narrative, but not a lot of down in the weeds digging. So what happened then in the course of education was that there were very few schools and very few trained teachers. The teachers who were trained were normally trained by their own professions. So they were bookkeepers who taught accounting, there were engineers who taught engineering, and there were missionaries who taught how to persuade people that what they said was true. So this was, I think, the state of affairs that you will find in chapter 1. At the end of chapter 1, there's a kind of summary because I felt that chapter 1, setting the stage, deserves a summary of its own. So if you really feel that chapter 1 is long and feels old or antiquated, you can always skip to the last page and have a summary in preparation for chapter 2. So all I will say about chapter 1 to sum up is that it shows a kaleidoscope, a very fractured, multifaceted society, insufficient administrative structure. And so many things were attempted, not many things were deliberate, and all the teacher preparation originating in Singapore itself, most of it was accidental and unintended. So although that sounds a bit harsh, you will find that it is generally true. So what about chapter 2 then? Is chapter 2 any better than chapter 1? Does it illuminate us more? I think that one of the things about chapter 2 is that it's deliberately divided into something akin to what the Singaporeans call the CMIO classification. It's stratified by race. This issue is a thorny one because Singapore prides itself on having a harmonious multiracial society. But the point really that I will continue into chapter 2 from chapter 1 is that the Chinese dominated simply because they were the most assuredly commercial of all the people who were running the show. For them, education for women was a matter of strengthening not only the bonds of society, but the ability to influence society. You'll find that because of that, mission schools were in an uneasy equilibrium. The equilibrium was between secular education, which the Chinese merchants valued, and spiritual education, which they did not value so much. So when it came to teacher preparation, they trusted, the Chinese merchants trusted the missionaries because they were careful in spending, they were responsible, they seemed to know their subject material, and at the same time, they didn't trust them because they were afraid that their children would be proselytized. They would turn into Christians and forget their ancestors. And that situation was what held back part of teacher education, because if teacher education was carried out by the missionaries, then surely the teachers would end up being effectively missionaries as well. So that was a hard truth about the state of education on the English language side. The Chinese merchants were having their children educated in English. It was seen as a commercial proposition and at the same time a dangerous one. For the Tamils, it was a different matter because the Indian population in Singapore saw themselves initially as transient. They had come to Singapore to trade. They would be going back to India, unlike the Chinese who believed that they had come to Singapore to stay. This meant that very few Tamils actually went to school in the conventional sense. And in turn, that meant that when you set up a school for Tamils to teach them English or mathematics or anything, the attendance was low. So many of the early Tamil schools fell by the wayside or were subsumed. This meant that if you imported teachers, if you got the professional teachers imported from Madras, which was the case in the early years, many of them transited to become English language teachers or humanities teachers, and they hardly taught Tamil as it was supposed to be taught. They didn't teach much about Tamil culture. They didn't teach much about many of those things in the Tamil language. What happened was that they were absorbed. So education for the Indians was a rather dicey proposition in the 19th century because formal education was sparse on the ground. That left the Malay population. And the Malay population itself is a construct that Raffles created. He lumped in everybody who he felt was Islamic in some nature. He called it the Malay population. He separated the Malays, which included Javanese and Sumatrans and so on, from the Arabs. So you have an Arab street and you have Kampong Java, but slowly the Malay population and the Arab population in common relations began to grow together in the area of madrasa education. And I think one of the untold or relatively untold stories is not that it hasn't been told, but has been not an active topic of discussion in the big room, is the success of Singapore's madrasas. Because Singapore's madrasas, from the studies that I've read and from looking around and talking to people, they are genuinely world class. Reason being that they integrated very quickly into the commercial proposition. They also integrated very quickly into the administrative structure. So you will find that although madrasas still teach religious education and provide a grounding in Quranic studies and so on, they also provide a valuable secular education. And that's one thing that quite a lot of people still value. So what happens in chapter 2 is that eventually it comes down to matters of what content and what delivery, and were you messing around with the commercial proposition? If you are messing around the commercial proposition, if your missionaries were getting too active and it wasn't adding to the economy, then the government was not very happy with you. If you, on the other hand, provided a good secular education and a steady stream of clerks and managers, then you were fine. So at that point in time, you'll find that schools like Raffles Institution were receiving about anywhere up to 13 times or 15 times the government grant that the missionaries were receiving. However, the missionary schools and the Chinese schools were producing results which were in many ways on par with the government-financed Raffles Institution. So that was the state of the schools in Singapore. But teacher preparation was still something that, while mooted as early as the beginning of the 20th century in 1902 to 1905, it did not actually become a viable proposition till the Chinese schools began in 1919 to educate their teachers in a classical Chinese way. So there were a lot of incipient bits of teacher preparation in those years, but the teacher preparation was patchy, it was spotty, and when the government got its ideas about teacher education going, it turned out that they were not entirely followed through with, but it was the Chinese schools that launched us into the second half of the 20th century. And so that's my 2 chapters, more or less.
Hello again. And so let's move on chapter 3 and chapter 4. I'll discuss the 2 chapters together. And so Alistair's chapter actually ended with the beginnings of the first formal teacher training, the establishment of the TTC, Teacher Training College, which NIE, National Institute of Education, can trace a lineage to. So again, like Alistair, I will also talk more in terms of the context, especially the educational context. And a large part of chapter 3 actually discusses the all-party report for commission and report for Chinese education, because that sets the whole context actually of the subsequent educational blueprint for Singapore. So one of the key recommendations, it was initially the all-party report inquiry and commission was looking initially, the remit was looking at Chinese education, but as we know, this the recommendation extended beyond just Chinese education. And I think Alistair has mentioned about the segregation of schooling or English, Chinese, in terms of different language streams. So this report, although initially intended for only Chinese schools, the recommendations was for all schools. So one of the key recommendations I think we all know is about bilingualism, but some of the other key recommendations would be the teaching of civics to all schools. And it has, of course, far-reaching impact on the subsequent education development of Singapore. And what another thing highlight is that the recommendation wasn't just bilingual, it's trilingual, because Malay was seen as the national language, and the aim was that of Singapore eventually, rejoining Malaya, and which happened in 1963 with establishment of Malaysia. So there's a key recommendation of Malayanization of the curriculum. So one of the key things as well. And even with 1959, with the coming to power of the current administration of People's Action Party, did not signal a break in the policy. The reason is because the PAP has already signaled that they would adopt even the PAP in 1959 adopted most of the recommendations of the report, all-party report on Chinese education, as a blueprint for Singapore's subsequent educational policy. And this is an important context to take note, because it's implications in terms of what the training of teachers in Singapore. So TTC was set up initially to provide pre-service teacher training for non-graduates as an English for primary schools. And subsequently, a Chinese branch was added in 1954. So the TTC initially offered full-time 2-year certificate course and 3-year part-time course. But they are not the only formal providers for teacher training. The University of Malaya back then was 2 campuses, right, in Singapore and KL. The University of Malaya and subsequently University of Singapore from 1962 and Nanyang University did the pre-service teacher training for university graduates. So something to take note of. So the TTC remit was to teach the non-graduates. So people, university graduates, wanting to be teachers. Some of them were trained in the University of Malaya and subsequently University of Singapore and Nanyang University. So I'll say that significance of TTC establishment as marking the institutionalized or formal teacher training in Singapore could arguably, I think, be a little overstated. Nonetheless, the key narrative of the history of TTC is the process. I think the key thing from henceforward, which Jason will touch subsequently as in subsequent chapters, is how TTC and later NIE got the virtual monopoly of teacher education in Singapore, especially in terms of initial teacher education for primary and secondary teachers. And my chapter, I talk about, especially chapter 4, I discuss the development of the TTC and how that impacted on in terms of the TTC's curriculum. TTC took on most of the teacher training programs for pre-service teachers of Chinese, English, and Malay schools. The massive school building program from the 1960s also that led to exponential increase in pupil enrollment. So that's another implication also is a part-time teacher training as a response because of the space as well as to meet the resulting teacher shortage. So one of the things is arguably is that the rapid expansion of schooling would have the unintended impact, or maybe intended, that the quality of teacher training had to be somewhat sacrificed over quantity to alleviate the resultant teacher shortage. And consequently, the TTC administrative and teaching staff are preoccupied with routine work and have the time for reflection, innovation, self-improvement are circumscribed. The part-time students are under heavy pressure of work, and it's very tough, but it's because of having to alleviate the teacher shortage. And by the 1960s, TC also have taken on the responsibility of secondary initial teacher training in addition to primary teacher training. And over time, by the 1970s, what happened was that the University of Singapore and Nanyang U gradually discontinued the initial teacher education program. So it was more of not by design, but more or less by default rather. And another part of chapter 4, I discussed about the establishment of the Institute of Education, how the transition from TTC to IE. It was actually meant to be established in 1971, but there was a bit of a delay in the establishment. It was meant to establish in 1971, but it was officially set up in 1973. The reason is because there was a delay due to reconsideration to allow IE to confer undergraduate and graduate degrees. That's the reason why. But then, be that as it may, by 1970s, TTC has become the sole teacher training institution in Singapore, even before the formal establishment of IE. With the closure of the School of Education at the University of Singapore in 1971, and the discontinuation of Nanyang University's Department of Education by the 1960s. So by 1971, TTC then enjoyed more or less a virtual monopoly of initial teacher education. But the delay in formation of IE also they allowed for a major review in the curriculum, which also carried over to IE. So one of the curriculum saw a shift away from a more of an apprenticeship and technical training model of the normal school towards an integration interplay of theory and practice. And the late Dr. Ruth Wong had a major part to play in that. But we can see that, so the intention was to have a good intersection of theory and classroom practice. But as we can see subsequently, this is still a major tension, the interplay between theory and practice. And the establishment of IE in April 1973 was aimed at improving both the quality of teacher education and training in schools. So I'll pass it over to Jason to talk about the development of IE as well as the universalization of teacher education in Singapore.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Yeow-Tong and Alistair. What I'll be doing is I'll be picking up the narrative and taking us through a very quick survey of the past 4 decades, beginning in the 1980s. As Yeow-Tong has pointed out, it's not possible to provide a comprehensive account of every single development in teacher preparation. And that's why I will select a few highlights. Let's start off with the 1980s. What was happening in the Singapore education system was, among other things, the increasing differentiation of students, for example, through the introduction of streaming at both primary and secondary levels of schooling. There was also diversification in terms of provision of education, for example, through the introduction of independent schools, and later on in the 1990s, autonomous schools. So let's come to the topic of teacher education. What were some of the major highlights in the 1980s? Let's start off with the invitation by the education minister that was extended to a British professor, William Taylor, whose brief was to review professional and academic activities of the Institute of Education within the wider context of educational provision in Singapore. Professor Taylor was also asked to identify strengths and weaknesses in teacher training. Between 1980 and 1983, he issued a total of 3 reports. Let me just highlight some of his key recommendations. Number 1, he talked about what he thought was the outmodedness of part-time teacher training. Number 2, the haphazard division of responsibility between the Institute of Education, the Ministry of Education, and schools for teacher professional development. Thirdly, the limited amount of educational research that the Institute of Education had been conducting. Fourthly, the gulf between theory and classroom practice, which is something that Yeow-Tong mentioned earlier on. And next, the failure to attract more outstanding university graduates into teacher training. Taylor also pointed out that female students were disproportionately represented in the Institute of Education's enrollments, which he viewed as a problem in the sense that male students would not be getting enough male role models. One of Taylor's key recommendations was the establishment of a Faculty of Education within the National University of Singapore, and the awarding of qualifications by the National University of Singapore. He also recommended the establishment of a Bachelor of Education degree. And he said that this kind of partnership between the National University of Singapore and the Institute of Education would permit the recruitment of high quality staff and also upgrade the teaching profession. What else was taking place in teacher education during the 1980s? We saw the establishment of the Educational Research Association of Singapore in 1986, and the subsequent establishment as well of a Center for Applied Research for Education within the Institute of Education. Another exciting development that I'd like to highlight during the 1980s was the upgrading of physical education teacher training. The College of Physical Education was established in 1984. And another development as well was the beginning of full-time in-service programs for school principals and department heads. That was in the mid-1980s. Moving along a few years, in 1989, the Minister of Education invited yet another British professor, Frederick Dainton, to review the development of university education in Singapore over the next decade. And in his 1990 report, Dainton recommended, among other things, the merging of the Institute of Education and the College of Physical Education. A second recommendation was the establishment of a bachelor's degree in education in order to deepen teachers' understanding of and competence in educational theory and practice, while allowing for subject specialization. And Dainton suggested that the institute resulting from the merger of the Institute of Education and the College of Physical Education could be affiliated with either the National University of Singapore or the Nanyang Technological University. Dainton warned, however, about the potential dangers of academicization of work as the institute tried to compete with other university faculties. Around the time that Dainton was working on his report, the Ministry of Education had formed a development committee to study the issue regarding the merger of those two institutions, as well as to look into possible improvements into the primary schools teacher education preparation needs. This committee issued a report in 1990 in which they claimed it was hard for the Institute of Education to attract talented applicants. And they recommended, therefore, the establishment of a degree in education by 1991. They also supported Dainton's recommendation regarding the merger of the Institute of Education and the College of Physical Education. And the new institution resulting from this merger would be known as the National Institute of Education, which would exist as an independent institute within the Nanyang Technological University. This committee also recommended retaining non-degree training within the National Institute of Education because they claimed the degree program wouldn't be able to attract enough students. As a result of these developments, the postgraduate diploma in education primary program was introduced for the first time in 1990 in order to recruit more university graduates into primary teaching. And this meant that there were now 3 possible routes into primary school teaching: the bachelor's degree in education, the postgraduate diploma in education primary, as well as the non-degree diploma program. All of these developments that I've just been describing represented what some observers have referred to as the universitization of teacher education in Singapore. One of the key outcomes of this process was a big boost to the status of primary school teaching. And we saw a very rapid change in the educational profile of primary school teachers from 0.67% of primary school teachers having a bachelor's degree in 1990 to 27.6% of them having a university degree in the year 2000. Let's look at 1996, which saw the beginnings of a major teacher recruitment drive. And along with this recruitment drive came a big change in the way teacher trainees were regarded by the Ministry of Education. Instead of receiving teaching bursaries, they would now receive full teacher salaries. And this change represented an almost 90% increase in their remuneration. At the same time, I think another change I'd like to highlight was the introduction of a provisional graduate teacher scheme, under which untrained university graduates could be recruited on short-term contracts before eventually joining the National Institute of Education. The idea was to familiarize them with the scope of teachers' work and to give them an opportunity to affirm their interest in teaching, as well as an attempt to reduce the gap between theory and practice before they enrolled in the National Institute of Education. And this scheme evolved into what is now commonly referred to as contract teaching, and it has become compulsory for almost all pre-service teachers in the National Institute of Education. Let's move forward now to the last 2 decades or so in Singapore, which of course have continued to see yet more education reforms, yet more diversification in the education landscape, yet more reforms to streaming, the introduction of subject-based banding, the emphasis on character and citizenship education, greater emphasis being paid to the needs of special needs students, the direct involvement of the Ministry of Education in the provision of preschool education, and more concern for social equity in education. What's been happening in the last 2 decades? Well, some of the highlights include the announcement by the then Education Minister in 2009 that only university graduates would be recruited for pre-service programs by the year 2015. And his subsequent announcement in the following year, 2010, where he projected an all-university graduate teaching workforce by the year 2020. Well, his visions haven't completely come to pass. The NIE has substantially reduced its recruitment of non-university graduates for its pre-service programs. However, not however, if we look at the educational profile of teachers in primary schools, they have, or this profile rather, has improved tremendously. And the latest figures I have is, or they indicate that over 80% of primary school teachers have at least a bachelor's degree, which is a far cry from 0.67% in 1990. One issue that Taylor raised in the early 1980s persists, and that is the predominance of females in pre-service programs. Another highlight I think is worth taking note of is the increasing involvement of the Ministry of Education in teacher professional development, especially in-service teacher professional development. For example, the establishment of the Academy of Principals in the year 2002 and the establishment in 2010 of the Academy of Singapore Teachers. This academy has several subject chapters which represent what is known as networked learning communities, where very senior teachers who are referred to as principal master teachers and master teachers take the lead in terms of raising professionalism and leading the way in terms of teacher professional development for the entire teaching service. There are also other academies and language centers that have been established within the last decade or so. Then every school now has professional learning communities to encourage teacher professional development. Another highlight, I think, is the development of what is referred to as a tripartite relationship involving the National Institute of Education, the Ministry of Education, and the Nanyang Technological University. There's another way of looking at this relationship which has been written about recently, which is called the Policies, Practice, and Preparation Model, in which the Ministry of Education is the lead agency of education in terms of developing policies and taking charge of resource provision in the schools and direct implementation of various education policies. And within this model, the schools are referred to as the key. They have this key role of translating Ministry of Education policies into practice, while the third prong within this model, the National Institute of Education, has the task of translating policies into relevant teacher preparation programs. In summary, I've taken us very quickly through the past 4 decades. And as I said earlier, it hasn't been possible, unfortunately, to provide a comprehensive and thorough coverage of everything that might have been covered. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. So I'll just briefly give tie up some of the salient points that is that's in this book. I think one of the key, but first I think I'll just touch a little bit on what this book does, some of the limitations of this book. One is we do not claim to be comprehensive and definitive, as I mentioned earlier. Another thing we did not touch on was we did not talk about the special education or early childhood education, and so consequently we did not fully discuss as well the teacher preparation, teacher training for special education teachers or early childhood education teachers. Be that as it may, one of the key theme, I think one of the key messages on this book is that teacher preparation education in Singapore, as what Alistair mentioned, is being it started off being rather accidental, and I would say rather maybe haphazard and non-institutional, especially in the 19th century, to one that is a bit more incidental and formalized, where we see the beginnings of that in the interwar years between First and Second World War, but clearly so after Second World War, it became more systematic, especially with the establishment of the Teacher Training College, followed by Institute of Education, IE, and then the National Institute of Education, NIE. So NIE is clearly the successor institution of TTC and IE. And also one of the key things that is that NIE's and IE and TTC's role as a sole teacher training institute in Singapore, especially in the training of initial teacher education for primary and secondary teachers, it was not a preordained one. And we know in this book we highlighted that the University of Singapore and US, the predecessor institution, University of Singapore, and Nanyang University used to do teacher training as well. But by the 1970s, the IE became the sole teacher training institute, when the then University of Singapore and then Nanyang University discontinued the teacher education programs. Whether NIE will remain the sole teacher training institute for initial teacher education in future, well, it's hard to say. But I was just end with a quote from the book's final chapter, and I quote, "Teacher training in Singapore went from informal to formal and from multiple providers to a single institution responsible for pre-service teacher education. In the last 2 decades, as what Jason has highlighted, the range of curricular offerings has diversified beyond the ability of teacher preparation systems to cope. So what we see, diversification in the education policy and curriculum landscape. But in response, should we then have more diversity in teacher preparation? That's the question that I think we would have to seriously consider and ask. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yeow-Tong, Alistair, and Jason, for your very insightful presentations and for providing those of us who have not had the luxury and the opportunity to read your book a very poignant summary of what was shared in the book. But I do urge everyone, do pick up a copy, take a read. Emerald Publishing. I do not know what else to do to plug the book because I do not know where it's available, but this is the book. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think having heard the perspectives from our 3 authors, together with the closing remarks and the opening remarks by Yeow-Tong, I think it'll be a very good opportunity to invite our 2 distinguished academics who are discussants for today's book launch to share their perspectives and to respond to some of the challenges, I guess, brought forth by the authors. So I'd like to start by inviting Dr. Kevin Blackburn to make his presentation as a discussant for today's talk. Dr. Kevin, please.
Thanks for the 3 authors giving their take on the book. As a discussant, I'll try and contextualize the book and give a variety of contexts. The first is the most obvious, is that it's part of a series by Emerald Publishing on teacher preparation in many different countries across the globe. There's national studies that are done on European countries, the UK, Scotland, France, other countries in Europe. There are countries in Africa that have their own volume, Zambia, South Africa. There are countries in North America, Canada, United States. There's a country, Australia, New Zealand, in Oceania has its own volumes, as indeed Chile in South America. I just looked at the series and it seems to be there's about at least 30 different countries come under this series of how teaching preparation is done at a national level. So Singapore goes into this context as one of the few Asian countries already studied by the series. Okay, so there are some overarching trends and there are some things that make Singapore exceptional. What seems to make Singapore exceptional is as been mentioned by the authors, is the monopoly that has grown up in the last 4 decades over teacher training, by the National Institute of Education. That doesn't seem to happen in many of the other national, studies that are part of the series. In America, you've got a diversity. You've got teacher training colleges happening quite early. In the University of Columbia, it has its own teacher teacher training college, and that's founded in 1887, quite early, compared to Singapore's teacher training college in 1950, and then effectively when it takes over so much of teacher training in the 70s. And this is documented quite well. I'll return to that later on, but still go for the comparisons. You've got the Institute of Education in London, which is 1902, and then you've got where Yeow-Tong is, Sydney's teacher training college, which is 1906. Okay, so this phenomenon of turning teacher training into basically a kind of college or a post kind of secondary education phenomenon is occurring quite early. And also, if you look at the early chapter, as mentioned in the early chapters of the book, in Singapore, it's the Malay teachers who are getting a teacher training college quite early in 1878. 1878, it's at Teluk Balang, a Malay teacher training college. So we do have that occurring quite early in Singapore too, actually, the teacher training college. It's later moved, on to Malaysia, actually, in Malacca, 1900, and then turns into the Sultan Idris Training College in Perak in 1922. So in Singapore's case, they have to wait, 4 decades or more, actually 5 decades from when the first recommendation is made in 1902 for this kind of superior way of teaching training. The old teacher-pupil system, whereby the master teacher gets a few pupils and they train them as teachers, and that's the informal decentralized system under colonial rule. Basically, that's seen as inefficient and ineffective and produces very bad teachers. So the idea of a teacher training college is one that emerges out of the 19th century, and it's early in many countries, but in Singapore it's delayed. Actually, 1950 is just so late. It's really well past many of the the developing countries, and also well past some of the colonial countries as well. But once it starts, of course, as the authors say, there's still other teacher training that's going on, because the TTC is just doing primary. You go to the University of Singapore and you see that they have their own education department from 1950 to 1971, and they're doing their own teacher training there. So you have, as the authors rightly point out, you don't have a decentralized system. Sorry, you don't have a centralized system until the 1970s. What you have is a very decentralized system until the 1970s. And the authors mention in the introduction why this is so. In a sense, you have the rise of what's called the developmental state in Singapore in the 1970s, whereby development is the goal. Actually, the government basically takes over, so the state takes over so many functions to increase economic development, raise the standard of living. The state becomes quite suffocating in the 70s and continues on into the 80s and 90s. So basically, there aren't these other kind of competitors around. Everything is centralized at this particular time. So in other places, you've got universities opening up with faculties of education all over the country, and you can see that in the other volumes. But in Singapore, you don't have that. Actually, you have a centralization that starts in the 70s with the Institute of Education being set up in 1971, and then in 73 they take over secondary training, secondary teacher training, as they've been doing primary for a while. So you've got that centralization that occurs because of the developmental state, which is the powerful Singapore state that emerges. And then the book concludes in an interesting way at the end. Basically, it looks at elements of decentralization that are emerging, like early childhood education is not strictly controlled by the centralization model. It's not something that NIE does, actually. So you see elements of decentralization occurring in the 21st century. The authors make the bold claim that perhaps it'll go back to the previous kind of decentralization model, where the schools are much more involved, and there is not much of a role for a centralized body. That's one of the interesting claims, that it's possible that it could go back. I would argue that because the developmental state is so strong in Singapore, and it's still very strong, that this centralization process will still be dominant for a long time to come. unless the state liberalizes itself, which is unlikely. And it's unlikely that the Ministry of Education will want to basically let go of teacher training the way other states around the world have, where there's a variety of universities with a variety of faculties of education. So it is a very good book. It addresses things like Singapore exceptionalism. Is the Singapore education system exceptional, or is it just a creation of historical circumstances? So we see that with that centralization that occurs in the 70s and 80s, that it seems to be a product of historical circumstances rather than something that's predestined. And where does it go from here? That's a very interesting question that it asks. So just quickly wrap up there, that it does provide an interesting case study with all the other case studies that have been done in this excellent series that Emerald Publishing House has launched upon. And it'd be good not just to read the Singapore case study, but to read others, in contrast, or there's parallels as well, actually, in terms of the transition to teacher training colleges. It's very well worthwhile to actually explore this at a comparative level, which the series does. And Singapore deserves a place, a prominent place in this series that looks at teacher preparation in many different nations across the continents of the world. So I'd like to conclude on that. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon. Well, it's noon. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to be speaking about a very interesting book on teacher education. I've been privileged in the Singapore education system to be in teacher training for quite a long time, and a beneficiary both of the earlier years of teacher training. I got my diploma in education at the Bukit Timah campus when it was part of the National University of Singapore, and we moved on from that to the Patterson Road campus, and we moved on from Patterson Road campus on to Jurong. So it's been a long journey for me, and much of what has been touched upon in the book has strong memories and relevance to my own lived history of someone who has experienced teacher education in its many facets. I think then the comments in the book with regard to the monopolistic situation is not something that is very troubling to me. I think there is some merit in a National Institute of Education, which is well run, which has the resources that it needs to provide a good program, and it delivers the goods. And I think the National Institute of Education and its predecessor institutions have provided that. So this alignment that we see in Singapore, which is an aspect of its history, the monopolistic situation, is for me a virtue. And the alignment between education policy, teacher preparation, and pedagogy in the schools is something that I'm comfortable with. One of the other comments that I think I found relevant in the book has been this issue of universitization. I know teacher preparation in Singapore, when it was not a part of the university and a part of the university. I think there's been tremendous benefits to universitization of teacher education in Singapore. I believe that the quality, it has enabled the NIE to raise standards with regard to the quality of students who are coming into teacher education. It has enabled NIE to be able to determine, through the resourcing provided by the ministry, the quality of academic staff and the sort of academic preparation and qualifications that they will have. It has enabled NIE to invest through, again, contributions from the Ministry in Education Research, which is fed into the preparation of programs for teacher education, into postgraduate programs, and policy making in the Ministry of Education. So for me, the universitization of teacher education has been a plus. There was some concern expressed in the book about the ways in which faculty might not compete, collaborate, compare themselves with faculty in the specific faculties of NTU. I've sat on many academic committees reviewing reviewing faculty qualifications for promotion and the same. I've never had an occasion when we asked somebody who was up for evaluation, how many patents do you have? I think we were sensible that institutional priorities, procedures were different. So while we were within a university, benefited from the university, I think we had a distinct culture and procedures about how teacher preparation, faculty assessment, promotions, and all the rest of it would come to pass. The other point that I would want to make is that while the book talks about universitization, it doesn't talk as much as I would have liked about internationalization. A part of the history of teacher preparation in Singapore is both that it was national and it was international. William Taylor has been mentioned, Lord Dainton has been mentioned. They were the early persons who contributed to the way in which NIE would develop. Even today, almost 40, 50 years down the line, we have the CJ co-professorships, where we have visiting professorships from faculty. And I think that's an important component, that NIE as a single institution has this virtue of being both national and very carefully national to attend to the policies that the ministry would like to see implemented, but it also has an international character, both in terms of the capacity that we have to build in the present NIE what is happening in the rest of the world, in the teacher education, the key teacher education institutions of the world, whether this be Harvard or this be Columbia Teachers College, or whether this be institutions elsewhere. So I think that's a virtue. And I think one of the benefits I see is my long experience with NIE is that we are now in a position to share the Singapore teacher preparation history and its contemporary salience for education to the rest of the world. There are examples of outreach, both coming to NIE, funded by the World Bank, African ministers of education visiting NIE to learn from our model of teacher preparation. And we've also been in the Middle East. The ECAE, Emirates College for Advanced Education, is modeled on the NIE model. So I think, although this is a historical account, if you like, of teacher preparation in Singapore, I would have liked to see a little bit of where we are, what is the journey taking us, and what might be the future. I have one concern. I do not see a diversification of agencies providing teacher education in the foreseeable future. I do not think teachers in the school system would want to be teacher trainers as well. They do play a role as practical supervisors, but to take the responsibility to them in the context of all that's happening in education, I think would not be desirable, nor would they welcome it. So for now, I have lived the history, and I'm very, very proud of where we are in the NIE and what we have achieved in teacher preparation. So always a statement, the quality of education cannot be better than the quality of its teachers. And if Singapore education is highly respected, a good quality institution, it is because teacher preparation has also been of high quality and of service to the Singapore education journey. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much to our two discussants, Professor S. Gopinathan and Dr. Kevin Blackburn. Ladies and gentlemen, we now transition to the Q&A segment of today's presentation. And I'm sorry if my eyeline looks a little bad, but I'm trying to look at this iPad for questions. So ladies and gentlemen, can I invite you to please use the Q&A function that you'll find on the Zoom at the bottom or the top of your screen to type out any question you may have for our discussants and for our panelists. If you like the question to be asked at anyone in particular, please do mention that in your question. You can also vote up other questions and like them, so do so if you wish. I see one question in the chat, which I'm going to ask. The question is from Anita. For a smaller country like Singapore, the centralized teacher preparation model is beneficial as the whole country has a shared vision to excel. With such a unified approach to education and the need to shine internationally, the centralized version is paramount with decentralized school-based autonomy on the delivery aspects. I should have read this before asking it. It's really more of a comment rather than a question. But I think it is an interesting comment to bring up because towards the conclusion, it was discussed about the possibility of a more diverse teacher preparation ecosystem within Singapore. And I think as many of you may be familiar with what the HEAD Foundation does, a lot of our work is in the region. Very little of it is in Singapore. We have been focused on building the capacity and the ability of educators across Southeast Asia. And in most countries across Southeast Asia, teacher education is dispersed. It is not handled or managed by a single institution, but instead it is done by various universities through their faculties of education. In some countries, you may have a centralized certification of teachers. There may be a central accreditation body, but the training and development is done through universities and faculties of education. So as we ponder this question, right? Singapore is small, Singapore is centralized, Singapore is easy to run and manage. So is diversity good, diversity bad in its absolute sense, or should we be considering the context in which it operates? So for developing countries in the region, I'd like to hear the perspective of our authors and our discussants. Should many of them be considering centralized teacher preparation institutions? Could that be a way to improve the quality of teachers in these countries? Sorry, would anyone like to answer the question? Feel free to unmute, put your hand up. Oh, sorry, if I ask the question totally tangential to the, but Alistair, yes.
I think I'll make a comment on this from my viewpoint of the person who started with the 19th century. What we've observed is that for city-states such as Singapore, a very small polity, there isn't actually a lot of hinterland in our teacher offerings. There's not a lot of variation in the kind of programs that we have, although we have tried to diversify. So what we've got is limited decentralization, but majority centralization. I think it's a good hybrid. For example, we have schools that teach the International Baccalaureate. We teach a general paper. NIE doesn't offer courses in this. We require training in cognitive neuroscience. NIE doesn't offer a lot of education in this, although parts of Nanyang, the university, actually do supply a little bit of that. So what we are looking at is majority centralization, very useful, very helpful in maintaining the goal of a small city-state, but a little bit of decentralization, which is actually what the government has required of us. So you will find that in 2003, when Tharman became Minister for Education, he actually provoked us into considering different kinds of education, sometimes with suppliers of training from elsewhere. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a large degree of centralization, which, as Prof. Gopi has pointed out, is still valuable for a small city-state. That's my comment on that.
Thank you, Alistair. Do any of our other speakers have something they'd like to add in before we move to the next question?
Can I make a comment? And then it's also, we tend to think of the national system of education and the National Institute of Education. But Singapore, the small island, is home to a large number of foreign students, a large number of institutions from elsewhere. So in a sense that if you wanted to do a master's in education, you were not, as it were, constrained by only going to the NIE. There are a variety of institutions that provide for that. And so in a sense, that diversity is not centrally controlled, but the diversity exists, and there are opportunities then for the teaching force to do what it needs to do.
Thank you, Prof. Do you have any other comments? Because we have another question before we move on. Okay, so I think the second question, it's really pertaining to the establishment of NIEC, the National Institute for Early Childhood Education, if I recall correctly. Now, the question is, do you see NIEC as part of NIE teacher preparation rather than as part of the work skills qualification, the WSQ? Any opinions? Would you see the transition of NIEC away from being part of the WSQ framework towards that of teacher preparation and within the NIE? Okay. I think that was a challenging question, but nonetheless, right. So I think there's an interesting question from Wendy, and this is to Prof. Gopi's comment about the internationalization of NIE. So Prof, Wendy is asking, you have a large number of international faculty who come to the NIE, but how involved are they in teacher preparation?
Well, if international faculty come to NIE, they are primarily there as teacher educators. They're not there as what other function would they have? Because they could be content specialists, but we have more than enough of our content specialists. They might be specialists in a particular area. So faculty recruited from abroad are qualified. Faculty recruited from abroad would fit in with what NIE's needs are at that moment. So I don't see a disconnect between foreign faculty in NIE not preparing either at the pre-service level or at the postgraduate level, or even in the conduct of education research, activities which I believe services the needs of NIE, and through NIE, the needs of the national system.
Any comments?
Yes. I can speak from my experience also, because my training many years ago, several decades ago in NIE, one of my two teaching areas, one's history and the other one was English. I subsequently taught more history than English. But remember, for English, and that's right on what Prof. Gopi mentioned, one of my tutors for English was English language was actually, I think he was from Canada. Dr. I forgot his first name was Farrell. So he was from Canada. He subsequently went to Canada to teach, but so this is one example already. And in the English, I believe there are a few in the English language and literature division that are from foreign faculty. And then you have Dr. Kevin Blackburn as well, who has done his part as well. So it is, and myself also, I'm a permanent resident. I'm not a citizen of Australia, and I'm teaching history education. So it's not about, I think it's not, as I agree with Prof. Gopi, it's not good to think about, foreign or local. It's about the people who can do the teaching, who can prepare the teachers. It's not about their nationality or where they come from.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, as one of these foreign staff who came in 1993, by 1994, I was doing teaching practice in the schools, sitting at the back of the class, observing the students after a training program, that we had, that was running at that time for, foreign staff to get used to Singapore schools. And it has been the case that, staff from overseas, with, academic qualifications that are university level, have been doing these type of things in terms of, teaching practice and teacher preparation for many years. Actually, the model that had has been developed, has been a very adaptable one. As Gopi has said, and a few others have said, that it has been highly adaptable and highly successful in terms of teacher training. I would argue, just from what I've seen, actually. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Do you have any more comments on the earlier question before we move to the next?
Can I add on? One of the things that I think where NIE benefited from foreign faculty has been when we wanted to start off on doing education research. And we just did not have the capacity within the local faculty, as it were, to be able to do that. We relied quite extensively on Australian academics who came over and helped us establish the Center for Research in Pedagogy and Practice. And that is, I think, a very beneficial relationship, because now we have the capacity to do it, but it was a time when we weren't able to do it on our own.
Thank you very much, Prof. Gopi. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask one more question before I invite everyone to make their closing remarks. I think the last question, once again, is very pertinent to the work that the HEAD Foundation does in the region. And the question is from Domante. I apologize if I pronounced your name wrongly. The question is, which characteristic of Singapore's exceptional teacher preparation model may work in a decentralized system? I know many of you sitting on the panel come from decentralized, have taught in decentralized teacher preparation systems in countries where there are multiple institutions, where autonomy is provided at the state level, sometimes even at a lower level. So your perspectives on this, please. Anyone? What characteristics of Singapore's exceptional teacher preparation model may work in a decentralized education system?
I'm going to make a victim of myself in this case. I actually carry out training for the International Baccalaureate. We do have alternative qualifications, and the ministry, of course, is not directly involved with some of the alternative qualifications available. The International Baccalaureate now runs a fair number of programs in Singapore, qualified schools who are International Baccalaureate World Schools. So that's one area, qualifications which are not administered directly by the Ministry of Education, so they don't train teachers for that. There are also some other skills training areas which can be carried out. I would say that these areas like them, they sprout out more and more, because if you look at things like ChatGPT, so the ministry has gone on record for saying we should allow AI chat machines and so on, to machine learning entities to be used in schools. But you will require specialist prompt engineers and so on, specialists, to think about how exactly you're going to integrate these things in. And the initial phase of such preparations probably is not going to be carried out by NIE. It will be sort of on a guest program basis before it becomes fully integrated, if it becomes fully integrated at all. So I think historically there's precedence for this. Look at ICT, for example. ICT training in NIE. It used to be outsourced at first, and then now it slowly becomes part of pedagogical training in NIE, right? So I think that to and fro, the to and fro situation between different kinds of training is an important one. It enriches everybody, and NIE can't handle it all. That's my 2 cents worth.
If I might add a comment, there are virtues that Singapore has exploited given its small size, right? And a government that is committed to educational quality. And I think we have learned a lot of lessons. So one of the big problems in teacher preparation is the disjunct between theory and practice. How do you teach in an institution separated from the schools, that doesn't have the training schools, and then a whole diversity of schools where teachers teach? And I think some of the experiences, some of the models some of the lessons that we have learned may be applicable in a more diversified context, not on a national scale, but on an institution to institution scale. So there are lots of innovations, I think, in the Singapore education system, not just with relation to NIE. For example, the academies that have been established in the recent past, they might have some relevance in countries which are diverse, like Indonesia or Vietnam or Philippines, for example. Or teacher preparation institutions in these countries which want to look at successful or innovative models, like how to blend theory and practice, how to make sure that the practicum is workable and in the ways in which it might be workable. This has not really been written up as such, but there's a lot of expertise in the faculty in NIE who served there for a long time. And I think that may be a way in which some of the successful learning experiences of teacher preparation, professional development could be utilized in countries which are interested within a sort of maybe ASEAN framework or whatever.
All right, thank you very much, Prof. Gopi. I see we have one or two more questions, but unfortunately, I've been reminded by colleagues to be sensitive of the time. So I'm going to invite our three authors, Alistair, Yeow-Tong, and Jason, to make a quick 1-minute closing remark about the book, about their work, and also a little bit in response to the discussants. 1 minute each, you don't have to share a minute. So 1 minute each, please make your closing remarks before I conclude today's session. Thank you.
Can I start off?
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate, I think, the comment by Professor Gopi about the inadequate attention paid within the book to the topic of internationalization. That's a very valuable comment. And I think one of the few mentions of that in the book would probably be the recruitment of foreign-born students to try and make up for local recruitment shortfalls in subjects such as Chinese language and Tamil language. So that was something that I mentioned in the book, but I fully acknowledge your very valuable comment about the inadequate treatment of that very vital topic, internationalization, within our book. Thank you.
I think I'll go next and leave Yeow-Tong to round up. I would like to respond in particular to a comment made by Professor Michael Barr, who wanted to know about restrictions of resources. I think that at the beginning and throughout the history of Singapore, it's not been a resource constraint so much as in a question of where the priorities for resource allocation should be. I think of the 1980s as a period where a lot of elitist ideas on education were put forward, because it was a kind of, we should put the most resources where the most advances could be made. So you could create a sort of trailblazing environment where elite schools would generate programs which would trickle down to the rest. And for a while, this was a painful thing for many educators in Singapore, because you would indeed see so-called elite schools absorbing all the supposedly best teachers and the best programs. But I think that over the long term, for example, in the gifted education program, you see that many of the things that the gifted education programs learned turned out to be applicable to areas of education elsewhere. Because as we, from 1991 onwards, as we learned more about cognitive neuroscience, we learned that you could apply the same kinds of training ideas or educational ideas, pedagogical ideas to education in other sectors. For students who appeared less academically able, we're able to raise their standards of achievement and also their standards of practical output. So we're not talking just about grades, but also in the way that they thought as groups and the way they developed social awareness, community projects. So they learn to think as collectives, not so much as individual elite students. And I think that was valuable. It remains to be seen how valuable the education process will continue to be in that way. But I don't think we're as elitist as we were in the 1980s. That's my take on it. And thank you very much to my fellow participants too. Yeow-Tong, over to you.
So a hard act to follow to round up, but I do also acknowledge what Prof Gopi mentioned about one of the shortcomings of the internationalization, because there's a long history, as historians will know, globalization, internationalization. The words may be recent, but there's a long history. I think another part to think about that, besides internationalization, is globalization. We did talk about that in the late book, but I think historians will know that the word is new, but the ideas of globalization has gone further than that. And that the trust, also another part is the transnationality of it. And it's more implicit in the book, but we could have made it more explicit, the transnationality and the globalization, because that will set a good context for internationalization. I think this is something that one of the shortcomings which I'll acknowledge for our book. But then there's something that future people, when you look about that gives scope for the more histories of teacher preparation to be written, to look at this area, globalization, transnationality, and internationalization, as well as the effects of colonization as well, and imperialism, which is also alluded to, but not fully developed. I think future work would have to look at the intersections of all these concepts and how they impacted on teacher preparation.
Thank you very much, Yeow-Tong, Alistair, and Jason, for your closing remarks and your insightful perspectives. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to pick up a copy of the book, Teacher Preparation in Singapore. I do not get a commission for sales, but I will keep on repeating. Please pick up a copy of the book. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today for the Head Foundation Dialogue, where we had the privilege and the honor to launch this book. A book that is very meaningful to the work that the Head Foundation has been doing, because we truly believe that the quality of educators is the most critical factor in any successful education system. And if we want to see education systems across Southeast Asia improve, importantly, so that students have better opportunities, we at the Head Foundation must continue to learn from best practices such as those in Singapore and replicate what is suitable and appropriate in countries around us and across the region as we look to improve the quality of educators. For many of you who are joining us today for the first time of part of our new and revised Head Foundation Dialogue, you'll be pleasantly surprised to learn that we are taking a hybrid format. The COVID pandemic, like it is for everyone else, has taught us the opportunity of going hybrid, that we can reach a far wider audience than when we used to just having our talks in our auditorium. We still will have guests in our auditorium for certain talks, but we will be available on Zoom and maybe even other platforms as we move forward. So on that note, can I urge everyone, I'm going to open my phone and read this because this is part of technology, to join us for our next public dialogue, the Head Foundation Dialogue, on the 2nd of March, How Policy Happens, opening up the black box of education policy making. We have a very distinguished speaker joining us, who very fortunately is coming through Singapore right at that point. And I urge each of you to sign up on Zoom. Check out the link, which my colleagues will be posting in the chat box soon, and sign up and join us for this talk. It promises to be an evening of insightful perspective on how is policy made. We are all victims or beneficiaries of policy, particularly education policy. But what goes on behind the scenes? How is this made? Let's try to figure out what's behind the black box. So do join us for this session on the 2nd of March at 6 p.m. But beyond that, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us in this afternoon's Head Foundation Dialogue. I hope you learned something as I did, and that you found this to be an insightful conversation. Stay in touch. Drop us a line if you have any comments or feedbacks on how we can improve our dialogues. If not, thank you and goodbye.